I would now call on Sylvia Boyce to approach the podium to provide her presentation respecting enforcement of the Criminal Code and the Westray Bill.
Okay. Yeah, I'm short. Okay. Get closer together, okay?
Moved by Powers, seconded by Pearson. All in favor? Carried. Now, with respect to the public hearings, we have 6.1, 6.2, and 6.3 all speaking on the same item, and they're here today. Welcome, lady and gentlemen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mayor, councillors, my name is Sylvia Boyce. I work for the United Steelworkers National Office as a health and safety staff rep, and also I'm responsible for health and safety for Ontario and Atlantic Canada as the District 6 Health and Safety Coordinator. I am here today with my colleagues from the Hamilton Steelworkers Area Council, in which we are doing a joint presentation together. For the record, I have Mike Misio with me, Darren Green, Frank Michelli, Peter Ridehouse, Frank Crowder, and Mike Hanachuk. We are very appreciative for the opportunity to appear before you today to speak about a very important issue that not only impacts the people of Hamilton, but people all across Canada. Every year, over 1,000 Canadians die at work. It's one of the worst records in the developed world. In fact, Ontario has the highest fatality rates per jurisdiction in Canada. And we are here because we have a national campaign that we are launching with a motion. Our campaign is clearly about educational and awareness and enforcement of a law that already exists, known as the Westray law, the Westray amendments to the Criminal Code. And what we're basically here to talk about is this law was passed more than 10 years ago through the House of Commons when they came together in an historic vote to unanimously pass the Westray Act. The legislation came in response to a horrific Westray coal mine explosion in Nova Scotia, May 9th, 1992, and after a strong lobby campaign for no more Westrays. The legislation was intended to hold employers criminally responsible for serious workplace injuries and deaths in cases of negligence. Unfortunately and tragically, 9 years later, 9,000 Canadians have been killed on the job, and yet not one corporate executive or single individual has faced a day in jail. To date, there have been very few criminal charges. Often the charges have been dropped or plea bargained to lesser charges and fines. The analogy is this: whenever someone is killed on the streets, the police immediately assume it may be a criminal act and open up a criminal investigation. They collect evidence and examine things with an eye towards possibly laying charges. The public expects to see that the guilty go to jail. The same could be said when you look at drunk drivers or domestic assault and gun violence. Yet when someone is killed at work, there is no collecting of evidence as if it were a murder investigation. There's no charges laid and no one goes to jail. Workplace fatalities are not looked at through a criminal lens of accountability. We believe that that has to change, and we are not alone. The families who's lost their loved ones as a result of workplace fatalities stand in our quest for justice. While not directly under the jurisdiction of local government, we are asking that you support this campaign because we recognize City Council as leaders in the community, and this is a community issue. This is not a union issue. Workers are being killed every day across Canada, regardless of their affiliations to unions or not, that people are being killed. The Canadians who have died at work are parents, their coaches, volunteers, the people that you see every day, the people who helped build Hamilton, the people you represent, and as representatives of the people of our community, we need your support to convince senior levels of government that this critical issue needs attention. I would now pass you over to my colleague, Mike Misia.
Hi. Sadly, Hamilton's has had its fair share of workplace fatalities. In fact, in 2013, the following people lost their lives because of work: Michael Robinson, Paul Jackson, Norman Reagan, Gunter Schultz, Gabriel Padano, and after the day of mourning in 2013, Kevin Rapazzo, Christopher Birdsell, and of course Shyler Six, the 9-year-old who died just before Christmas. If we could show you the video at this time, if possible.
Yes.
Okay.
Every day, millions of us get up and go to work. Sadly, many don't get to come home. You see, every year, 1,000 Canadians are killed on the job. It's one of the worst records in the developed world. It's sad, wrong, and preventable. In fact, Canada has a law that says if you kill a worker, you could go to jail. It's called the Westray law, named in honor of the 26 miners killed in a horrific explosion in Nova Scotia. But a decade after the United Steelworkers helped get the law passed, some 9,000 workers have died, yet not a single person has gone to jail. That's because the law is not being enforced. What's worse is that the number of workplace fatalities are actually rising. Every worker deserves the right to come home. It's time to stop the killing. Enforce the law.
Jordan was a very fun-loving young gentleman. He was always full of life, and to him, life was wonderful. He lived his life in the moment.
He would be there for you in a heartbeat, and no matter what time or no matter what day it was, he was always there for you.
The knock on the door came about 3:30 in the morning, and there was two people standing at my door. Well, Brian answered the door, and they came in, and they didn't say too much, and then they just said there was an incident. I mean, I said, an incident? What do you mean an incident? Is Jordan dead or alive? Well, we can't tell you that. All we can tell you is that he has no vital signs. And then we had to go through all the horrific stuff that any parent does not have to do, is to make arrangements to bury your child.
My brother Jordan Fram was working with Jason Chenier on June 8th, 2011, when a run of muck overcome the two of them, and they were both killed instantly.
350 tons of muck and water and sand. When they opened the gate, there's a lever to open a gate, because I guess it was blocked. All of a sudden it was like a huge explosion. I definitely do think someone should be held accountable. Should be company and supervisors, management, who were aware of the situation and have known about it for years. And
in the instance with Jordan and Jason, this accident had happened, a very similar accident had happened a few years before at that mine. The management at Stobie Mine knew that there's an issue with water, and those issues had never been rectified. If companies were held criminally accountable for their actions, this incident would never have happened. people would have taken more responsibility to make those changes if they knew that their lives were on the line as well. You know, if they knew that they could go to jail as opposed to their company with these deep pockets simply paying a fine that means nothing to them. We continue this fight for our neighbors, for our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers. We never want somebody to feel that hurt again, and we want to make those changes.
And we know that Jordan would want that as well, because that is something that he would do. He would fight.
A resolution has been submitted for your consideration. It reads as follows. Therefore, be it resolved that this council urge our provincial, territorial government, specifically the Attorney General and Labour Minister, to ensure that Crown attorneys are educated, trained, and directed to apply the Westray amendments. Dedicated prosecutors are given the responsibility for health and safety fatalities. Police are educated, trained, and directed to apply the Westray amendments. And finally, there is a greater coordination among regulators, police, and Crowns so that health and safety regulators are trained to reach out to police when there is a possibility that Westray amendment charges are warranted.
We believe that this motion will help ensure that training is ongoing, that our Crowns and our police are educated and trained to apply the Westray amendments. The solution is to have a system where all parties are trained to investigate and prosecute serious industrial accidents. There needs to be clear lines of investigative authority, and the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Labour should be working together in cooperation and coordination. And we believe these actions are doable, and we believe that these actions will contribute significantly to ensuring that when Canadians leave for work, they come home safely. A mother who lost her son in a horrific workplace accident said something to me that I will never forget, and quite frankly penetrated very deep into the core of my soul. She said, "There is nothing worse than sending your loved one to work with a lunch bag, only to have them come home in a body bag." Therefore, we are respectfully requesting that this council lend their voice to support this campaign and pass this resolution and ensure that parents don't lose children and children don't lose parents because they went to work. For your information, I just wanted to let you know that the Sudbury City Council has unanimously passed our motion last week on January 28th, supporting our resolution and our motion. And yesterday I was up in Sault Ste. Marie, and Sault Ste. Marie has passed this motion unanimously as well. And furthermore, there are presentations occurring across the country at various municipalities. We have met and are seeking meetings with all attorneys generals in every province across Canada and the heads of prosecution as well. And we've also reached out to the police organizations. In fact, we had a meeting a couple weeks ago with the Hamilton Police Association, and we presented our campaign and our motion just like we did here today. And the Police Association Board of Directors voted in favor 8-0 in support of this campaign for education and awareness. And next week I will be meeting with the Canadian Police Association Board of Directors as well. So we clearly are working with the authorities, and we want to. This campaign in any way is not laying fault, attacking or blaming anyone. We have a law. The problem is it's not being utilized because of lack of knowledge, education, and training, and we're simply asking that it be enforced. When you look at Canada's statistics alone and Ontario's, it's clear that there's a need for coordination and direction amongst all regulatory parties. Thank you very much, and we'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
We do have a list of questionnaires, and first on the list is Councillor Duval.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and Sylvia and Darren, Peter, Mike, and Frank, and who else we're missing here? Thank you, and Mike, thanks very kindly. I really appreciate you coming out and making us aware here in this council. I commend you for what you're doing, and especially going across the country and asking municipalities to never forget the Westray mine disaster. I mean, it should never have happened. But I do have some questions to ask you. I understand that we do have a policy in the city of Hamilton with our police department that deals with policies, procedures of an accident in a workplace. Is that true?
Yes, my understanding is they do. The Hamilton Police Department does have a policy, and there are other other municipalities in Canada, in some parts of Canada, that do have a policy in place. And this is a good thing that they have it. The problem is not necessarily resting with the policy. The problem is the education and direction from the top down. So when I say that, I'm referring to the attorneys general. They are responsible for the administration and direction of justice in our provinces, and they work collectively with their colleagues, the Crown prosecution and the police. And there's a clear disconnect and lack of coordination and sharing of information and support. And that is where it's wonderful that Hamilton has a policy. We feel that this campaign and our request, this motion, will only enhance and help our authorities do their job to the best of their abilities, like they always do, but they'll get support and resources, and it will enhance that policy.
Okay, and I thank you for that. And so that this would not change anything. This is basically just enforcing and making the awareness and making sure the proper people have the education of remembering them of the Westray Act.
Absolutely, correct.
Correct? Okay, so we're not, Sylvia, you're not here today to change the law, Bill C-45. You're here today, I understand, is to make sure that it's not forgotten, to make sure that the proper procedures are in place right out through the country, not just in certain areas, but make sure that every municipality understands what that is, and not just industrial accidents they walk into and call it industrial accident. It's about enforcing Bill C-45, holding those accountable that are responsible for having a safe workplace. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Duval. Just so you know that in regards to workplace fatalities, as I mentioned, this is not a labor issue. It really is about working people, regardless of anybody's affiliation. And although there could be policies in place in certain cities and whatnot, the reality is that policies can often be changed and amended and adjusted. But when there's clear direction and support for education from the proper authorities, then there could be coordination, and ministries of Labor's and the ministries of justice can work together to help prevent it. And sadly, I mean, I'm ashamed personally. I'm a very proud Canadian and a proud Hamiltonian. I've lived here for over 35 years, but when Ontario has the worst record for fatalities, workplace fatalities, compared to any other province, I think we all should be very concerned with that. And when Canada has one of the worst records in the developed world, you know, those numbers are alarming, and I think that we all have a responsibility to work together and do what we can to educate and provide support and resources to the regulatory bodies and the justice system so that we can prevent this.
Thanks, Sylvia. And I just want to remind you to your group also that I know this council does care about the Westray bill, and you know, we've sent our condolences throughout those years, and in fact, it was just a little while ago where this council voted to send a representation down to the 20th anniversary of that, in remembering the disaster, and that was, they sent myself down, and I was very proud to represent the city of Hamilton, along with another Hamiltonian, Fred Dale,
Yes.
who was a citizen at, actually made up 26 angels of stained glass to give to each family, and not only said it was from himself, but actually from the city of Hamilton, and I know they were very proud of that. So I will listen to my other But, Mr. Chair, just asking you, do you want our comments now, or do you want to wait?
There are other questions, but if you'd like, I have no problem with you putting forward your motion accordingly.
Okay.
And I'll recognize that
But
accordingly as well.
if you want, I mean, I'd like to make some comments also that I know of.
Well, perhaps we should exhaust the questions, and then we can
Okay.
come back.
And
for the
if
motion.
you come back to me on
Sure,
the list,
absolutely.
I appreciate it. Move the motion. Thank
So
you.
next on the list of questioners is Mayor Bertina. Mayor Bertina?
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. What do we know about other jurisdictions in the world? Because the most famous culpability that I recall was a Japanese airline crash. And the CEO or the president took his own life as expressing guilt for the terrible calamity that occurred. But does this in fact happen in other jurisdictions around the world?
Do you mean our campaign as far as education and enforcement, or?
Are you aware, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, of other jurisdictions that have laid charges against corporate executives with regard to deaths in the workplace?
Yes, there has been some charges laid in the UK and also in Australia. I'm not sure, Mayor Bettina, in regards to Japan and some of the other countries, but certainly Canada itself has one of the worst records in the developed world when we look at workplace fatalities. But there are some other countries that are now doing their own type of, campaign and requests for education and training, and it involves different regulatory bodies as well as their justice system, but their governments are administered significantly different than ours for the most part.
So what we have before us is a simple request to show action on what already exists in legislation.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mayor Bertina. And we have Councillor Clark, then Pearson. Councillor Clark.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for appearing before us today on a very serious issue. I'm wondering if you can answer a couple of questions. When there's an injury in a workplace, I know the Ministry of Labor responds, and normally the police department responds. Those are the only, other than EMS or that, but is there anyone else with investigative authority that responds?
No, actually, what happens is in the event of a workplace fatality or serious injury, the police are called and the Ministry of Labor are called in, and then there's, a sharing of information, of facts as to what happened, and then the actual investigation and whatnot is passed over to the Ministry of Labor, Health and Safety investigators, and they do the inspection, and then they basically determine whether or not charges should be laid under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, not under the criminal code.
So the police, at some point, they say, okay, it's in your hands, see you,
Yes.
Charlie, and Charlie's left there as the labor inspector.
That's correct. And it's not because the police are washing their hands of it, it's because of the direction that they are given from,
For 20 years.
Yes.
And let's talk, if we may, Mr. Chairman, about the labor inspector. What charges can the labor inspector lay, and under what act?
Okay, well, the labor inspector can lay a multitude of charges under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for negligence, covering various aspects. So there could be fines. Obviously, usually they are fines. And if I bring your attention to, for example, when we just watched that video there, those were people from Sudbury, Ontario, and that event happened in June of 2011. And what happened was the recent charges and decision were published, and it was decided that there was going to be $1,050,000 fine for the fatality that took place at the Stobie Mines in Sudbury. And that fine itself, although it was the largest fine under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario, and the fact of the matter is, when you're dealing with large corporations, it simply becomes a cost of doing business. And as far as the police being able to lay charges and proceed, just the way the process worked, they came to the scene, and then after their investigation, it was handed over to the health and safety regulators. But there was clear evidence of negligence, workplace negligence, and the fact that management was aware that there were machineries that were not guarded properly, that there were certain faulty equipment and procedures in the workplace, but there was no consequences. And it's real. That's one example. And I'm sure you've all heard of the Metron construction, fatalities of 4 workers, killing 4 workers in Toronto, and 1 seriously injured. The fine was initially there under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. People were charged under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and the fines were initially assessed at $200,000 with a victim surcharge. And after appeal, that fine had increased to $750,000. In some of the documents that I did leave for you today, there's a legal brief that will basically, it summarizes what's happened in the decade since the Westray amendments were passed. And to date, although you've heard there's been over 9,000 deaths since that law was passed, and each year approximately 1,000 workers die on the job, there's only been 10 criminal negligence charges to date. And of those 10 charges, as I said, many of them were either dropped or they were plea bargains, and there was only 3 successful prosecutions, which all ended in plea bargains. 2 were in Quebec and 1 was in Canada. And when we have been meeting and speaking with, some attorneys general from other provinces and our own, and police and other regulators, they're all claiming, some of them, they really don't have that education and training, and they're not coordinating and working together in regards to understanding the Westray amendments and how to actually apply it. So there's a huge disconnect.
There were attorney generals indicating that they don't have the training?
Well, no, I'm sorry, I misspoke on that. Not the attorneys general. They are saying that they've been given the Westray amendments and the law, but the actual chances of them being successful in criminal charges, it's a difficult task for them to follow when there's various partners involved in the investigation of workplace fatalities. And when the police show up and then they are gone and then it's turned over to the health and safety regulators, often there are flaws in the investigation process, and unfortunately, there have not been enough utilization of the Westray amendments. There are some provinces specifically who feel, attorneys general feel there needs to be more training. Specifically, Manitoba recently announced that they were going to have a dedicated prosecutor directly responsible for workplace health and safety fatalities. And Nova Scotia recently, actually after the 20th anniversary event when Hamilton City Council sent down some representatives to support the Westray commemoration, there was meetings, and the attorneys general there and the Crown prosecutions got together with the minister, and they have now implemented a dedicated prosecutor to deal with workplace fatalities and recognize that there needs to be consistency and coordination. And presently, British Columbia, I'm sure you all must have heard recently with the 2 BC sawmill explosions in Prince George, where 2 workers were killed in both explosions and 20 plus were seriously injured in both, that the Globe and Mail, I believe it was a week and a half ago, I don't have the exact date, but it was clearly determined that there was an unlikely chance of a successful prosecution, although the WorkSafe BC, which is the same as our WSIB here in Ontario, concluded that there was negligence and charges should be laid. The RCMP had determined that there was a flawed investigation process amongst the 3 parties that were involved, and unfortunately there was no chance of successful prosecution. Hence, that speaks to the need for this motion, and in fact, British Columbia and the RCMP and WorkSafe BC are working on, it's almost ready, I think it should be published very soon, a memorandum of understanding where those three parties will work together in the event of workplace fatalities.
One more question. When there is a workplace fatality and the labor and the police show up to investigate, if there's a decision to proceed with criminal code charges, there has to be a threshold at some point that it kicks in. And what I'm saying is,
That's correct.
they show up at a plant, this is the first accident, they don't lay criminal charges if it's the first accident and everything looked appropriate. They only consider laying charges if there was reckless disregard in an ongoing record where they did not act with diligence to fix the matter to provide safety for the employees, and that's that reckless disregard
Yes.
that raises the bar for a criminal proceeding.
That's correct. And if you look at the what the actual Westray amendments state, that basically, in brief, if a person with the duty to take all reasonable steps to prevent bodily harm to a worker fails to do so, and in failing to do so acts within wanton or reckless disregard for the life and safety of the worker, then that person is guilty of criminal negligence under Section 219 of the Criminal Code. And then obviously, Westray Amendment and criminal negligence charges should follow.
Yeah. I want to thank you for lobbying in the manner that you are, because it's clearly educating, but it's shining a light on the decision makers, because as you know, there's someone that's making a decision, no, we're not going to do this, and they go away. But there has to be a more transparent process so we understand why they didn't choose to pursue.
That's correct. And Councillor Clark, Hamilton has we have a really strong supportive community in regards to health and safety of workers. And we have a beautiful monument out front where we pay honor and respect to all the workers that have been injured or lost their lives as a result on the job. And I mean, this campaign is, I'm saying this motion, I shouldn't say campaign, it's our campaign, but it's clearly a motion asking for education and training and in coordination of regulators and authorities. But Hamilton has that reputation for being concerned about a healthy and safe community for all. And I think that passing this motion not only helps the proper authorities and regulators do their job and get them adequate support, but it also is in line with Hamilton's vision and initiative for promoting a safer and healthier workplace for all citizens. And I know that our council clearly believes in that, because, I mean, even with the example of sending councillors down to Stellarton, Nova Scotia to participate in the 20th anniversary, I can tell you, although I'm from Hamilton, I represent Ontario and Atlantic Canada, and as a national rep, but Hamilton is really well respected, and specifically when that event occurred, the community and the government and the people of those 26 workers, the family members and the loved ones that lost their loved ones, were so honored and appreciative of Hamilton and their respect and support for workplace safety.
When Hamilton acts, others...
They do. They certainly do. Now, to be honest with you, we were getting this motion in place. We've made applications to many municipalities, and every municipality has a different process as to how you get your opportunity to present before the leaders of the community. And we are very thankful that Hamilton is one of the first, that we were hoping it would be the first, being that we are all Hamiltonians here. But what I honestly believe, regardless of how you feel about I know because we're a union and we're presenting it, there could be that image that, oh, well, it's the unions. But it doesn't matter. This is about people dying, and I cannot believe that there would be anybody in our country that is in a position of leadership in the community and in the province that would not support such a request.
I'm a former progressive conservative labor minister. I understand and agree with what you're saying.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful.
Okay, now, next on the speakers list is Councillor Pearson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Sylvia and team. First and foremost, I have to say that, yes, I'm married to a steelworker from U.S. Steel, former Stelco, 35 years retired, and watching the video, I can tell you that when he was in the machine shop, it wasn't so worrisome, but when he went out to the caster, every day, I went, don't tell me what you did. When I get the call, I'll deal with it, because that's what you live every single day. And I don't want to get emotional about it, but it is something that sticks in your heart, and you know what every family person goes through that could have a spouse or a family member in that situation. So I appreciate you being here today, fully supportive of this. And I just wanted to touch on, because you mentioned this is actually just an education and it's coordination. So I appreciate the level of this. This is most imperative, that we get the right people knowing how to deal with this and what they need to include in their views and their examinations and studies and everything else. Absolutely, from the Crown attorneys to the health and safety reps. But do we take it down lower to the level of the companies, the workers? Are they not so much educated, but are they informed? And the reason I say this is, do the workers know when they go in the lunchroom that this law exists, that these are situations that you have the right to put requests forward for something to be looked at? Or do they have to worry about, the whistleblower sort of law, that their job may be in jeopardy? I know it's intense.
No, that's actually a really good question. And Darren, did you want to come in on this too? Just so you know, the question you posed is very important. And it also comes to, I think it's important that when you as community leaders or others support this, we are not saying that every corporation out there is responsible for workplace fatalities and that they should be charged. That is not at all what this is about. We're saying that in the event of criminal negligence and that they fall under, that the actual negligence falls under the Westray amendments, that people should be held accountable. It's no different than drunk drivers or, if somebody dies in our home, the police will come in and they do a criminal investigation. So workplace fatalities and the workers that are seriously injured or die deserve that same respect and treatment, that there's an investigation through a criminal lens. And as far as employers, there's some excellent employers out there that have fantastic health and safety programs that are constantly, updating their education for their employees, their machinery and equipment. They're doing wonderful inspections. And unfortunately, there's ones that are not doing that, and they are not adhering to the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the standards that are required, including regulations, depending on the sector. And the sad reality is, when we've seen so far only 10 prosecutions, of which 3 were successful under the criminal code and all 3 ended in fines, it's not a deterrent. It's a cost of doing business in some extent, and there needs to be if just one CEO or individual, whomever they may be, were criminally charged and spent one night in jail, there certainly would be a paradigm shift in the health and safety culture in our cities, our provinces, and our country. And I think that, Councillor Pearson, we would have employers that are not following health and safety legislation and procedures. They will straighten out immediately because there's consequences to actions. And I'm going to let Darren just comment on this as well, because Darren has an enormous amount of experience in this.
I work for, ArcelorMittal, not the Fasco, but where the old Stelwire plant was part of Stelco back before 2005. ArcelorMittal, U.S. Steel, any of the major corporations, you open up a flyer and their safety is number one. That's what they say. They do, at ArcelorMittal, we have something that's called a journey to zero, and that means a journey to zero accidents. We have monthly safety meetings. We have an active health and safety committee. We do all the right things, yet when somebody calls the Ministry of Labor to put in an anonymous call or something, there's sometimes some kickback. And what we're looking for really is to make workplaces safer. This isn't about throwing somebody in jail. This is about having that possibility there so that our workplaces are safety, so that when we make a complaint to our employer, to our supervisor or manager, that they're taken serious and that we get the problems rectified in a much quicker manner. The almighty dollar. And we want the corporations that have the mantra that safety is job one to live it. And we believe that your help will get us there.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Pearson. Next on the list, we have Councillor Whitehead, then Jackson.
Thank you for coming. I worked very closely with Homer Siga that was instrumental in getting changes in the mining industry based on epidemiology studies, the high rise of cancer and silicosis in the uranium mines in Northern Ontario. So I certainly appreciate how things have evolved to try and protect workers. But I'm going to give you there's going to be a question, but I need to give you an example, a real life experience. I was a surveyor in a mine. I went into a heading. It's a big cavernous heading, surveying the heading. The back started to crack loudly. We grabbed our equipment and ran. We went on surface and reported it. Of course, they have engineering. They could record it. In that heading, they had a piece of a long hole drill, $250,000 piece of equipment. They sent Roger, a friend of mine, to go get the equipment. The back came down. It took a week to get to what was remaining of Roger. So clearly, the mine knew, because it was reported, that it was unsafe. And yet, they sent an individual in there to save a $250,000 piece of machinery. So I certainly appreciate and understand where we're going. The first question I have is the right to refuse work. I mean, at the end of the day, it's one thing to ensure that employers are held accountable. But the other side of that coin is to ensure that their rights are given to workers that identify a safety issue. In an example of Roger's case, and the reason why I told the story, he knowingly, or he didn't know, but if he knew that the back was that bad, he would have had the right to say no and not get punished for saying no and refusing to go into the heading. Do we have enough strength in our legislation to ensure that workers are forced to be put in unsafe positions?
You know what, Councillor Whitehead, you make some extremely good points, and I am aware of the work and the history of you with Homer Seguin and Elliott Lake and your advocacy for safer workplaces and healthier and safer communities. No, yes, there is a right to refuse unsafe work. And is our legislation strong enough? I don't think it is. My colleagues here could certainly add to that. But the problem with it is that although there's right to refuse unsafe work, there are consequences to people and workers that refuse the unsafe work. And by the time the actual process is worked through and determined whether or not there was a justified reason to refuse unsafe work, workers are later, they suffer consequences for reporting health and safety infractions. And, we all know how, difficult it is to keep and maintain a good, well-paying job with benefits, and especially in an economy where we've lost an awful lot of jobs due to the economic crisis and, the manufacturing sector. So there's a lot of pressure on workers not to report things, not to be the whistleblowers, and to just, do your job. We've been doing it all along. Nothing's happened. It'll be fine. Just move on. And unfortunately, our legislation needs to have stronger teeth and enforcement and support for anyone that refuses unsafe work. And they shouldn't be penalized by way of losing their job or losing pay. And then furthermore, there's consequences of that after the fact in the workplace, how you're treated and the types of jobs that you could be all of a sudden sent to do, which is all retaliatory often. So, the right to refuse is really good. The problem is having proper enforcement and procedures and protocols where nobody is penalized. Darren, did you want to add anything to that?
Just
Or Mike?
just that the inspectors, unfortunately, they don't have the power to come back and go after the company quite often. Most times with work refusal is put in and it's dismissed by the employer. People get sent home, and there's supposed to be a procedure. You do work refusal, you get your rep. They're supposed to bring you your rep. You discuss the situation, you try and resolve it, and there's steps that further go on. But what we hear quite often is that people just get sent home. You refuse? Okay, go home. So the guy's owed money. Well, the guy's only going to be owed so much money before he can't pay his rent or his mortgage. So they back down on that. And I've done a number of high school presentations on health and safety, and I can tell you, talking to the kids that are 16, 17, and 18 years old that are working in the car washes or at McDonald's or the Dairy Queen, they're afraid. They're afraid to ask the questions. They're afraid to stand up to their boss, and they're afraid to put in a work refusal. They want their jobs, and that's what it all comes down to. They want their jobs, right?
So, and I appreciate that, but I felt I better highlight that piece as well, because other people will come and say, well, we need to do this when workers can refuse. You just clearly articulated that it's great in principle, but in practice is not, and it doesn't work.
That has to be another lobbying campaign for us.
Actually, touching on the younger workers and the new workers that go out into the that was a comment that a question was posed by Sudbury City Council. One of the councillors asked about the training for young workers. They were concerned that they have young kids going out into the workforce and they're not getting the basic health and safety training that they would require, and specifically, Councillor Whitehead, to the right to refuse, the right to know. And what was made very clear is that, unfortunately, even in our Ministry of Education policies in the curriculum, there is not mandatory health and safety training for all students. It is specific to, if you're in a co-op, if your child is in a co-op, then they will get some health and safety training. And our union has a program called the Young Worker Awareness, or the New Worker Awareness training that Darren speaks to, and we volunteer and we'll go into any school in any city and any community and deliver this program, letting the kids know of their rights and responsibilities, and understanding the workplace environment that they're going into. And sadly, as Darren pointed out, they are afraid, and rightfully so, because of the way the employers are not respecting, and I don't mean all employers, some employers are not respecting the legislation, and they're not putting their kids through training, health and safety training, and saying, listen, if you see a problem, don't be afraid. You come and tell me right away, and we will rectify that. And kids, unfortunately, are afraid, and, you know, they're going into the workforce. And there is a high number of injuries among the youth. And furthermore, that same attitude takes place in many workplaces where workers are afraid, because, as Darren said, they can send you home if you refuse. And while the process is being invoked, somebody's home, they're losing days' pay, and they have children and, you know, a wife or bills to pay, and they just can't make it. So there's that culture of risk-taking in some cases because the lack of education and support in the workplace.
And I appreciate that. And I guess just the last piece is I want to thank the steelworkers on the international side. I remember meeting with Wayne, who went to occupational health, was invited by the labor force in South Africa, and he came back, and I remember talking to him, and he said, Terry, they do not, from the statistic point of view, and deaths, they don't record African black individuals that were dying in the mines. It was only the whites that they're recording. He said it was just absolutely incredible. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Whitehead, we now have Councillor Jackson and Ferguson. Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Nice to meet you, Sylvia, and your team of men there behind you, good leaders and advocates. I had a little taste, before just a couple of quick questions to help me further understand your campaign. I had a little taste back in the late 70s of dangerous workplace, and that to help pay my way through school. Worked a couple of summers in the coke ovens at Dofasco. I was a door cleaner, and taught me workplace lessons and life lessons as well. So I got a little flavor for how dangerous a workplace can be. So Sylvia, let me just understand, before the Westray Amendment, only the owner of the company or the CEO could potentially be charged under the criminal code, and the Westray amendment made it that any manager, supervisor, foreman, through you, Mr. Deputy Mayor, to help me understand that a little better, please.
Sylvia?
That's correct.
Okay. Secondly, just curious, it's been 10 years since House of Commons unanimously acclaimed the amendment. Is it because the USW and others have tried to have faith in the criminal justice system that your campaign has begun just in the last, I'll say the last few months, late last year into this year, that you're making your way across municipalities and provinces? Or am I missing something? Or again, was it just a hope that the amendments would lead to what they were intended to be? I'm just trying to understand the timing of your campaign at this time, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Through you, please.
Sylvia?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Jackson. There's certainly our campaign, there is certainly hopes. There have always been hopes since the Westray amendments were passed that if somebody was criminally negligent and responsible for workplace deaths or serious injuries, that there would be accountability. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Although the Westray amendments have been utilized, they've been slowly utilized by prosecutors. And what came to fruition was when we went back to Stellarton, Nova Scotia on the 20th anniversary, there were family members that were there, and they spoke to Councillor Duval and Darren Green, myself, and other directors and politicians that were there. And you have to remember that that happened 20 years ago, so there would be widows, and then they would have their children that were like 22, 23 years of age. And we had 2 young women specifically and a young man come up to us and say, you know, we're really thankful for the Steelworkers campaign and lobby in regards to Westray, and we're thankful for the governments that support it. But what's happened? Why is nobody being held accountable? Why did my father have to die? Why, as of yet, has not one single individual been accountable the way they would if you killed somebody on the street? Why is it okay to kill somebody in the workplace? And these people, when they said it, I mean, Councillor Duval would recall that. And that's what we had a discussion after all of the politicians were there, including at that time it was Premier Darrell Dexter, who's no longer obviously in office, but he himself said, you know, a lot of valid points were made. And the reality is, after speaking to many regulators, authorities, and whatnot, it became abundantly clear that there seems to be this huge disconnect and lack of knowledge and coordination and sharing of information and working together and training. So it led us as steelworkers to say, we made a promise and commitment, as did, many politicians, that there would be no more Westrays. So we decided that the campaign is clearly something that, why is it not happening? Why are the Westray amendments not being utilized more and effectively? And it was determined that there seems to be this big disconnect and lack of coordination, and there needs to be education, training, and direction. There has to be clear lines of direction from the top down and clear lines of investigation programs and prosecution. So that's kind of what led to our campaign. So although we are directing our campaign at the justice makers who are responsible for administration and justice in the provinces, specifically the Attorney General. We are also feel that it's important to meet with the heads of prosecution and the police organizations, from the associations to the chiefs of police, and the very important community leaders that you all are, because we need support from our community leaders to get the provincial government to implement this type of training and apply the Westray amendments in the event of workplace fatalities.
So it sounds like you almost reached a threshold where enough is enough, and you said, that's it, we need to take some action and make people more aware.
That's absolutely correct, and that's how we feel, like enough is enough, and hence our campaign is called Stop the Killing, Enforce the Law. We have a law, it's just not being enforced.
And you've referenced drunk driving, domestic violence, so I guess eventually, ideally, you'd love to get this issue elevated to that level, Mr. Deputy Mayor, through to Sylvia?
Yes, it should be, this issue, a workplace, serious workplace injury and fatality should be looked at through a criminal lens and through criminal accountability. If it's determined that there is none, that's wonderful. Absolutely, then hand it over to the health and safety regulators and then let them do their work and look at laying charges under the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Okay, fair enough. And ironically, Mr. Deputy Mayor, didn't the company win some award, some national or corporate award, a month or so before this tragedy happened, Sylvia?
That's absolutely correct, Councillor Jackson. And during that time frame, they received this national award for wonderful health and safety programs, which touches to the concerns and the question that Councillor Pearson had asked about safety and training in the workplace. And they received this award, and then a month later, there's an explosion and 26 workers are killed. And there was a record of ongoing health and safety complaints and concerns in the workplace, yet they received this award. Many years later, after the Westray law came into effect, that award was obviously taken away, but that is tragic and, incomprehensible. And Justice Richards made a comment about the wanton, reckless disregard for human life, and unfortunately, these kinds of things happen all over, and sadly, because of the global economy, we have large corporations, global corporations that are doing business in our country, which is great. We want work. We want people working and we want the economy to be booming, but some of those corporations have different health and safety standards and laws that they apply in third world countries. And they themselves, come into our country and may not be so diligent or aware of our health and safety laws and practices and procedures. And then there's that kind of culture in the workplace where the right to refuse, people are afraid to exercise it because of consequences.
Good luck with your campaign. It has my support. Thanks, Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jackson. We have Councillor Ferguson next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Sylvia. I'm sorry I missed the start of your presentation. I was trapped on the 403. But I was pleased to hear you say that not all employers are bad.
Absolutely not.
That's important to note. I think a number of employers work very hard. I know I ran a large company with about 850 employees as a CEO, and I tell you, not only was I petrified of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but she had a duty to make sure every employee got home at night. And we had 4 people full-time in health and safety. Every management meeting, first item on the agenda was health and safety. We had weekly tailgate meetings where curriculum were sent out to foremen, and they're required to have every employee signed that they received that tailgate training. And I just want to turn the tide on you a bit, though, about work refusal. The manager of health and safety reported directly to me. I didn't want anything skewed coming to me or filtered. I wanted to hear it straight from them. But one thing I'd like to know where the steelworkers sit on this is, if we caught an employee, repeatedly, there's progressive discipline, who wouldn't work safely, they wouldn't tie off, because in the construction industry and highways, you're up high, you're down deep, you're working around utilities, traffic, airplanes, and so it'd be progressive discipline. But if someone wouldn't tie off, for example, or walking across a bridge with no railing, we would send them home and say, you're going home for 2 days. And the next time you're sending them home for 5 days. Unions have a duty to represent.
Yes.
And those employees would file grievances that this wasn't reasonable. Now, you don't do this lightly. There's witnesses that would confirm that, yep, he did that. Now, none of them would progress to the board because it all gets settled. Where do the steelworkers sit if an employee tries to use progressive discipline to enforce health and safety, would you in fact file a grievance against the employer if the person asked you to do that, and your duty to represent, even though there was other members that witnessed it and saw that, yeah, he did go down in the trench without protection, or wasn't wearing his personal protective equipment, or wasn't tying off?
That's a good question, and your comments are, I appreciate them, and you're right, and I'm glad you noted that we are not saying that all employers are negligent and responsible for workplace deaths. There's many good employers. If you don't mind, I certainly will comment on it, but we have 5 steelworkers from various workplaces in our community that have had experience with that exact question that you asked, and I know that Darren could certainly comment on that from his perspective as the health and as the Steelworker Area Council President, and then I certainly would comment on that, my own personal view and the Steelworkers' view in regards to health and safety.
Darren?
This happens. There's a real conflict for us here, and that's why we have a health and safety committee that's got a mandate to make sure that workers are kept safe, and we've got chief stewards and stewards who do the representation on the other end of it. I can tell you, and it's happened many times, that where a person has come to me and said, hey, I got suspended for not wearing my earplugs. Well, this is the 4th time this guy's been told that he hasn't been wearing his personal protective equipment. So what do you want me to do? You're not wearing your stuff. And it comes down to, we want that guy to be safe. If the guy's blatantly out there disregarding every safety rule, I mean, he's going to die at some point. We got to get it through them. We work with the companies quite often to get that message through, because we don't want anybody hurt on the job. But you're right, it does happen. If we file a grievance, it's very rare on a safety occurrence, because it's just something that we agree with. I mean, as I've explained to my members, I've grew up with these families with the Christmas parties and the Labor Day picnics and everything else, so I know their kids, I know their spouses. I want them home at safe at night. I've got a responsibility to their families as well, and it's a responsibility that I take seriously, and I would think that most
Okay,
most
but the Act says you have a duty to represent.
Right.
Now, it says you must file a grievance on my behalf. Do you not have to do that?
I will take a grievance, but sometimes there's steps in a grievance too. There's a first step, a second step, a third step, maybe a fourth step, then there's an arbitration.
First time 1 day,
Right.
second time 3 days, third time 5 days,
Yep.
fourth time termination.
Yeah.
And so you follow that progressive discipline on it. And but you have a duty, do you not, by law, to file a grievance an employee asked to and defend that position?
As long as I'm not being malicious in my reasons for not taking something to arbitration, or I'm covered. We make decisions based on what's good for the employee, what's good for the union, and for our membership. And we have to show all our membership that health and safety, we take it seriously. So yeah, we'll take a grievance. How far it will go, we don't know. Will it go to arbitration on a health and safety grievance? Probably not.
Do you not need the Labor Relations Act to be amended to give you the right to not take a grievance on health and safety?
I don't believe we do. No. We've got a grievance procedure, and it's ultimately when it gets to a grievance, it's a grievance committee that will decide through that committee whether to proceed with a grievance or not. And it can be dropped at any time.
Because most supervisors don't like to get grievances. They like to, I think, have a good working relationship with their crews.
Yes.
If they find they're being grieved and criticized, they're going to be reluctant to take that discipline.
People grieve for a lot of reasons, and one of the reasons is just to show that they're angry. They know that they messed up, but I'm mad that I got sent home, so I'm going to file a grievance, even though I tell them, hey, you weren't wearing your seatbelt, you weren't doing this, you weren't doing that.
Safety glasses.
So what do you want? What do you want me to do? You weren't doing it, and they've got witnesses. What do you want?
Okay, I've made my point.
And I'll say 9 times out of 10 it doesn't result in a grievance, because we can talk to the guy and make him understand.
It is the chronic guys that go on and on.
No, absolutely.
Councillor Ferguson, sorry. I employed at Hamilton Specialty Bar, formerly Slater Steel. And I mean, if a worker is disciplined for health and safety reasons, if he wants to put in a grievance, I mean, obviously it's his own disregard for health and safety, but it's also the workers around him. So, I mean, we wouldn't pursue it. We have a third step grievance meeting that Competent people sit down and talk about it, and it wouldn't go any farther, if I could just add that.
And your question about the duty, yeah, we do have a duty. And if somebody files a grievance, then we have a responsibility to look into it and proceed with the various stages. And we advise our members, if we feel that their grievance has no merit and is wrong and that they were in error themselves, and we make recommendations to them. And sometimes, like Darren said, or Mike, we may not proceed further if we feel that there clearly is no valid to continue, and members may be upset with us because they feel we have to continue on the grievance at all stages and go to arbitration. And there could be complaints that we didn't represent them fairly, but if in fact it gets to the stage of arbitration, the arbitrators rule on the facts and whether or not there was merit and whether or not who was at fault, whether it was the union, the employer, the worker, etc. But we do have a duty, and it's common sense prevails, right? Like, you're going to tell somebody, listen, you weren't wearing your safety goggles, or you weren't doing this, and you were not following procedure, and you got disciplined and sent home. And like Darren says, well, what do you want me to do about it? You were wrong.
Okay, I think I've made my point.
Does that answer?
The only part that worries me is that, from my experience, the supervisors won't discipline because they don't want that go through that aggravation. So they turn their eyes the other way.
I can clearly tell
and so
you
we
that
coach them and coach them and coach them. Don't. And there's a grievance, we will handle it at head office. But they were proud of the fact that they didn't have any grievances. And when these pop up because they're trying to do the right thing. Anyhow, I've made my point. I won't take any more time. And the last thing, I support your resolution too, because there's a lot. These 4 people full-time health and safety costs $500,000 a year. That's a lot of money. And if my competitor's not doing it, it's an advantage he has in a very competitive world. And so there needs to be consequences if there is gross negligence, so I support your.
Oh, thank you very much, Councillor Ferguson. And, one point when we talk about business, there's that other side of it. When there's workplace injuries and people are off work and they're on workers' compensation benefits or weekly indemnity benefits because of their workplace injury, we all know that our country, there's over $50 billion a year that is spent on absenteeism from work due to workplace illnesses, injuries, and it's affecting our insurance systems. And the reality is if health and safety practices were followed and adhered to in all workplaces, and there was proper training and enforcement and education, we would not have as many workplace injuries and these statistics that we have today.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. We have no further speakers, I don't believe, but if I could just pass the chair over to Councillor Whitehead. Sylvia, many thanks for the presentation, and just to try to deduce what the main points of the presentation really are. From my perspective, what I'm hearing is that we have a law in place, and it's not so much the actual enforcement of the law, but the prosecution of it from the Attorney General's perspective. Is that correct?
Well, yes, except there is an enforcement part of it, Councillor Marilla, because it's not being enforced through the lens of the criminal code and accountability.
Excellent, and which brings me to my next point. So when somebody calls 911, through you, Mr. Chairman, and someone is dead at a scene, you feel there's an inequality in the way the police and the prosecution deal with it versus that of the general public. So if 911 is called, someone is dead at the scene at work, they acted differently from a procedural standpoint than they would if someone did that in the middle of Main Street.
Yes, and that's where it comes into that, looking at the workplace fatalities and serious injuries through a criminal lens. So they secure the scene, they conduct a criminal investigation if somebody's killed on the street or if there's a drunk driver, and they look at it through a criminal lens and determine if charges should be laid. Whereas in workplace fatalities, although the police go there and they do their job and then away they go, they pass it off over to the health and safety regulators, and then they carry on with business. And it's not looked at through a criminal lens.
And through you, Mr. Chairman, hence the importance of it being looked upon as through a criminal lens, so that the deterrence from a legal perspective is more prevalent. Because at present,
That's correct.
without the enforcement and the convictions, it really acts in no way as a deterrent to those that might want to circumvent the legislation. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, so just to bring it back to where I think the thrust of this initiative is, that's what it's all about. We're seeking equality in life and in death, and meaning we strive for equality through you, Mr. Chairman, in so many ways for a workplace environment, but in death, we're failing miserably, locally, provincially, and nationally, and all we're asking for is that equality. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yes, and when you think about it, it's about accountability too. There's accountability for one's actions, and if you knowingly and wantonly, recklessly have disregard for human life, and you don't abide by health and safety practices and standards that are legislated, there has to be accountability and consequences. Why are we held accountable for what we do outside of work, whether it's drunk driving or if there's an assault on the street? These things are all looked at through a criminal investigation and through a criminal lens, and then it's determined whether or not it warrants negligence and criminal charges. And that should happen when workers are seriously injured or killed at work, and that's what's not been happening, unfortunately.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, and hence we're looking at equality in life and in death, as well as the enforcement of the law to provide deterrence in order to provide accountability. And that basically sums it up. And most importantly, from my perspective, and I'll elaborate more under comments, is the fact of honoring the death of a worker. We call frontline workers in police and fire and ambulance and so on heroes when they die at work, but we don't for the average worker. And for me, I think they should all be considered workers and bring it to the same level of honor. And so at the appropriate time, I will mention that, and I'll take back the chair, and I appreciate your time. May I have a motion to receive the presentation? Moved by Whitehead, seconded by Duval. All in favor? Carried. Now, Councillor Duval, you have a motion, and then I have a list of speakers. So, Councillor Duval.
Yes, we have a resolution in front of us, and I would like to move that,
Moved by Councillor Duval?
Yes.
And I'll second that, yes.
And you're going to second. Can I speak to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate our delegation coming out today. But for the audience, I know it's been a long morning on this issue, but it's to show you the seriousness of what happened. And basically, many accidents happened prior to the Westray mine that were very, very neglectful on behalf of some of the people that were running the corporation. But Westray was the one, the straw that broke the camel's back. And back in July in 1991, up in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, jobs were needed very, very bad, and they were all excited about the new mine that was going to open up, and they all felt great that they could go and support the families. At that particular time, the company, the private organization that was running it, was basically violating a lot of the procedures that would go on to make that mine safe. And in fact, Liberal Bernie Boudreau at that particular time sent a letter to the Nova Scotia Labour Minister, and his concerns were that the new mine that was scheduled to open in just 2 months is potentially one of the most dangerous in the world. He put that to the actual Labour Minister. 2 months after that, 500 people attended, and everybody was cutting their ribbons. A whole bunch of governments came, and it was just, they were all proud because 300 jobs were being created over a 15-year period. When the mine opened, there were serious accidents that were happening every day, and then the steelworkers came in March because of the amount of complaints when they were organizing, and a person by the name of Mike Pichet said it very, very strongly out to the public that if something doesn't if corrective action isn't taken soon, he strongly feels that somebody's going to be killed in the near future. That was in March of 1992. 2 months later, a night shift went in, 26 miners, the mine blew up, 26 people were killed. They went to work just to earn money, and knowing that the incompetence that was happening and the intimidation that if they said anything, they were going to be fired and they can go home. It was a tragedy. There was an inquiry that happened because of the pressures, the public pressures that went on, that something has to be stopped. And one of those things that were stopped was there was a judge that led the inquiry, Peter Richard, and in his testimony, in his research, he found a mosaic of actions, omissions, mistakes, incompetence, apathy, cynicism, stupidity, and neglect. That was his comments after he did the inquiry. It was the worst thing that we've ever seen and that happened in Canada. The worst part about this is that when he did his inquiry, this was the title, A Predictable Path to Disaster. And this is where the actual corporation was named, and the concerns by the judge that the various government inspectors who ignored glaring safety abuses, among them inadequate ventilation design and maintenance that failed to keep methane and coal dust to safe levels. There also was problems about the unauthorized mine layout. No jurisdiction, no permission, no nothing. It was forcing miners to work in risky tunnels to get the coal out faster. And he was basically, the corporation, saying, get in there and do the work or go home and I'll get another person to do it. They thought human life were defective widgets, and that's how they used them. The most obscene thing I've ever heard of, there was detectors down there in the mines, methane detectors that would alarm the worker that when the ratio was too high, it was to get out and do something about it. You got to go get some fresh air. The company disconnected those actual pieces of equipment, and they did that purposely so they wouldn't want to do coal production. So many inadequacies was done in there, and this is why it took this type of disaster that the steelworkers and many other unions went forward for 10 years and finally convinced the Canadian government that people have to be competent and responsible for their actions they take in a workplace. And I look at the audience here today and I see some children up there, and we're doing this to make sure that your children are safe when they go on, when there's their time to go to work. You go to work to make money, you don't go to work to die on the job. And people have to be responsible if this happens. Somebody has to pay the price, and we want to make sure that the awareness is out there, that there's no more just a great latitude, you know what, we can hide by the corporate shield. If you do it, you're responsible, and you're going to be called up upon it. So I fully support it. I ask this council to fully support it, and I thank again our delegation for doing such great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duval. We now have Councillor Clark, then Whitehead. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Marula, and I want to thank Councillor Duval for helping these folks come before us today on something that is, one would argue, the most pressing issue in Canada today. When Councillor Duval called me at home and we spoke about it, I was quite surprised that we're talking about a law that was brought into being and proclaimed 2004, and yet it's not being enforced today. And that was a little bit upsetting for me, because while I was the Minister of Labour, I really tackled young workers being injured on the job. And it's still crisis proportions today. We have not really moved forward enough. Between 2006 and 2011, 52,000 young people between the ages of 14 to 24 will be injured on the job, and 39 of them will be killed. And I supported this law even before it became into the law. back in 2002, 2003, the ministers of labor were talking about making a law, federal, so that all provinces would follow it, that would enable Crown attorneys to proceed with criminal negligence charges. And it's not criminal negligence charges against any company that has a workplace injury. The criminal negligence charges are really, the Crown would only prosecute where there was a reckless disregard for life and safety, where there was a lack of duty of care, where there was actions without due diligence. That really means that you'd have to be an employer who was told that the elevator door won't close, and you were told every single day for 2 weeks, and then some poor person fell through the elevator shaft. That shows a very clear reckless disregard. So think about that. There are accidents like that occurring in Ontario today, and there are no charges criminally. The police show up, Ministry of Labor show up. Once the Ministry of Labor are there, and I made it jokingly earlier, but pretty much the police say, okay, you got this, and they walk away. So there's no forensics. There's no real investigation. Was it an accident? Or did his buddy push him? No investigation into that. They treat it purely as a workplace accident. Labor Ministry makes decisions, recommendations in terms of how they can prevent it from happening again. There's a funeral and everything's forgotten, except for the workers who never forget. So it's a little bit disturbing that we're at this point and no one can really explain to me why the Crown Attorney is not involved and responding to an accident. Now, I recall a young person, 18 years of age, working in a bakery, worked there for 2 weeks. The investigation indicated that he was not given any safety manuals. His father told him that the machine that he was using, which was a large industrial dough-making machine, should have a guard on it. So the son spoke to the owner, and the owner says, no, it just gets in the way, just be careful. And he complained 3 times about it. 2 weeks later, his arm got caught in it, and it pulled him right in. And he died that morning in the bakery. That's reckless disregard for human life. No charges against the bakery. Another young person that I remember when I was there, there are dozens of these stories I could tell you, and I had many sleepless nights because of this nonsense that was going on. His employer gave him a bottle and pointed to a barrel and said, I need some cleaning solvent. Pour the solvent into this container and then bring it to me. There was no explanations as to what the solvent was. There was no explanations about anything. He poured the solvent in. Someone came in with a lit cigarette, and he was engulfed in flames and died standing over the bottle. That's reckless disregard for human life. And that's what we're talking about. The fact that the Crown attorneys in the province of Ontario, and Mr. Chairman, I know many of them, they're good people. Someone has to give them the direction to prosecute. Someone has to say, look into these things and investigate. And they will. And they do a really thorough job. They're not being told to investigate. Now, I can tell you from my experience at Queen's Park, I found it fascinating that there was an organization that was dealing with residential care facilities, and the government was looking at bringing about regulations to make it tougher for RCFs and make it safer for the patients. Next thing you know, the RCF organization was holding large fundraisers for MPPs all over the province raising money. Do you think that legislation ever came to be? The legislation disappeared. Gone. I had issues with, I was the Minister of Transportation, I had issues with the driving education schools. And they started fundraising, and every fundraiser I went to, the driving education school chairperson was there with a host of compadres. And they were lobbying at these events. And while I'm writing the bill to create it, I'm being told by the Premier's office and the party to change the bill because it's too aggressive. It's going to cost the economy money. So the reason I'm saying this is there has to be a reason why a political party chooses not to say to your Crown attorneys, start implementing this law. There has to be a reason why it's not done. It's not, oops, we forgot about it. And I'm afraid that the economy is what they're worried about, because all the fundraisers are saying, if you do this, you're going to kill companies. They need to understand, and the public needs to understand, that these laws do not kill the company. They go after and prosecute the one person who had control and command over that situation and showed reckless disregard for life. So that one person, that one foreman, or that one board member, or those are the people that find themselves on the hook in a criminal charge. So it doesn't impact the economy. Actually, what it does is it makes the workplace a hell of a lot safer, which every statistic I've ever looked at shows the safe workplace means productivity goes up significantly. So I fully support what Councillor Duval is doing. I fully support what all these good people have taken the time to come down here and deal with. This speaks to the values of us as Canadians and Ontarians. And it crosses all party lines. Some of the people at the top of the parties may not like it because their fundraisers are saying this is a bad thing. Tell them to bugger off and enforce the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. We have Councillor Whitehead now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I told the story about Roger, and I think it's important, not just on Roger, but the 1,000 workers that die every year, according to the information we have here, and certainly the Westray. It behooves government to ensure that those families have a legacy. That legacy is a safer workplace, a right for individuals to go to work and to come home safely. Roger was an inspiring, very active in the community. I believe he was one of the top 5 pitchers in baseball in Canada, went to the Nationals 2 years in a row. He had a whole future in front of him. That future was robbed because of a piece of equipment worth $250,000. This is not about persecuting employers. We know that many employers are good employers. But when you take a look at our systems, whether you speed on the highway and get a ticket, you're held accountable. You're charged. Whether you drive recklessly, you're charged. There are many systems already in place to provide a healthy safety environment for the general public. Well, nothing should be less in the workplace. So certainly what is here before us, and certainly through my life experiences, is a part of that evolution. And I just mentioned to Councillor Duval when I was talking to him, what I'm finding, and I think it was sort of alluded to by Sylvia, there's third world type corporations coming in and buying companies in Canada. Inco was bought by a Brazilian company, if I recall. And I talked to some of the workers at a Sudbury about the environment and how the environment became much more conflict and health and safety issues became ignored. I don't think it's just unique to Valet, I think is the company. It's not just unique to Valet, but certainly there seems to be a different element, a different type of investor coming into this country trying to exploit or take advantage of workers. And I think it behooves us to ensure that the legislators are putting the proper tools in to hold employers accountable for workers in their lives when they place it in their hands when they go to work each and every day. So for those reasons, absolutely motherhood. If we could do more, we should do more, but this is a good start. I will be wholeheartedly supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. Are there any further speakers? I have myself on the list. Just, I guess, to deduce all the information that we have received today, and I think what the presenters are truly amplifying and trying to expose is the fact that we do have a law, but that law, unfortunately, has not been enforced to the same level as it should be. And as a result, the prosecution hasn't followed suit. Neither have there been convictions. And when you look at the purpose of a law, the purpose of the law is to have a penalty that will provide deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, and accountability. And none of that is happening right now. And the equality issue of someone dying on Main Street versus someone dying in a workplace, I think is concerning and disconcerting in the sense that if 911 is called for a death, I believe if someone dies in the workplace, it should be investigated as thoroughly as someone dying just on Main Street. And anything short of that, I think, is irresponsible. So in conclusion, I think I strongly support what's before us in Councillor Duval's motion, and I had probably met with the group, with Councillor Duval, and working with this particular issue. And even knowing it superficially prior to that meeting, in discussing the issue, I never recognized really how glaring the inequality is between the Main Street and the work death is until you look at the statistics. And even if you think of your own reaction to reading the paper, if you hear of somebody dying in the workplace, you generally say, wow, that was a terrible accident. But most accidents are preventable. So what can provide an environment conducive to preventing that death is a deterrent such as this particular law should be providing, and at present isn't. So as a result, I'm proudly seconding and supporting the motion that's before us, and I thank everyone for their involvement today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have Councillor Duval.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and just make this short. And I'm going to request a standing recording vote on this, but I just want to let the audience know and this council know that one thing I did miss out on is that when I said about the explosion happening, it was so massive that two nearby towns, the windows were shattered, and it just shook those towns. But out of those 26 miners, only 15 have been recovered. The other 11 are still on the ground, and it was so bad that they could never get them out of there. So just for information, thank you.
Okay, so on the motion, a standing recorded vote has been called. All in favor? I guess it could be recorded as unanimous. It's okay, Jeff.